Shifting focus to Syria, the country's coastal Alawite heartland has erupted in its biggest demonstrations since the fall of Bashar al-Assad last December. Thousands took to the streets on Tuesday demanding security, justice and a decentralized political system. But the day turned violent, with security forces firing gunshots to break up the protests. Protesters chanted for Syrian unity and invoked religious slogans. They held signs rejecting violence, demanded the release of detainees held by Al-Sharaa's forces after Assad's regime was toppled, and accused the new authorities of targeting Alawite men without due process. For many, the protests were a basic demand: safety.
To live in security, to go to school safely without kidnapping. This was the only place we used to feel secure. Now there's no more security, and we're exposed to kidnapping and fear. We only want safety.
We want security. We want the young men who were arrested to be released. We are being subjected to injustice, and we don't want this killing. We live with all groups, but they are very unjust toward us. There is great injustice on the coast.
But while the rallies began peacefully, the mood shifted rapidly, especially in Latakia's agriculture square. Witnesses say two rival groups formed. One, where Alawites demanded federalism and the release of detained men. And second, with pro-government supporters shouting insults. And then, about an hour into the rally, gunfire erupted. Video showed a man lying motionless with a head wound. Witnesses described panic as crowds ducked for cover and fled. Local officials said security forces fired into the air to disperse the groups and claimed unknown assailants also fired at civilians and security forces. There was no immediate word on casualties, but by afternoon, both protests had scattered. Elsewhere, tension spread across the Syrian coast. In Tartus and Jableh, crowds chanted for the release of prisoners and demanded federalism for the Syrian coast. Security forces moved alongside chanting demonstrators as fears of escalation grew. The Syrian Observatory of Human Rights recorded 42 protests across the Alawite belt on Tuesday. Nearly 9,000, mostly Alawite, ex-military personnel are still detained after surrendering to the new government led by interim President Al-Sharaa. These protests come after a year marked by brutal sectarian violence. Syria has faced repeated sectarian clashes since Assad, an Alawite who was ousted last year, and a Sunni-led government took power. In March, nearly 1,500 were killed in massacres that followed an alleged ambush on state forces by Assad loyalists. The Alawites are a minority sect concentrated along Syria's Mediterranean coast who revere Ali, Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law. So when the Assad family came to power in 1971, the community became deeply intertwined with the state's security, military and political establishment, placing them at the core of Syria's ruling apparatus for over 5 decades. And when Assad was ousted last year, the long-standing association with the regime triggered a wave of retaliatory attacks targeting Alawite neighborhoods and individuals. Critics say the backlash reflects years of wartime resentment and perceptions of collective culpability, even though many Alawites themselves suffered during the conflict. Syria's new leader, President Al-Sharaa, has since urged pan-Syrian unity, calling for an end to revenge violence. The latest protests, driven by fear and insecurity, reflect a community struggling to find its place under new rule. With gunfire dispersing crowds and emotions running high, Syria's Alawite coast has once again become a flashpoint in the country's fragile post-Assad order.
They promised glory. They delivered fear. They shaped nations. They scarred generations. From brutal purges to propaganda machines, from stolen power to violent falls from the throne. Welcome to The Dictator, a series that strips away the myth and then exposes the men behind the tyranny. History remembers their power. Firstpost reveals their truth.